Hey guys, Peter Steele here, back with another video for Hearts of Iron 4. And today we're trying something a little different. As you can see from the title, we are going back to the early days, and I will teach you how to play Hearts of Iron 4. This is a basic guide for those who have never played this game but really want to get in on it. So, without further ado, let's go. Single player, new game. Two scenarios here, 36 and 39. I recommend you stay away from 39 until you're comfortable with the game. It's also the least interesting of the scenarios. 36 is where it's at. And that brings us to the country selection, the first major choice that you will have to make. Up there are the major powers in the world in 1936, and below them, little old Poland. This is where you can find countries that have their own specific focus trees. They will be added through DLC. Right now there's just Poland here, because this is bone stock Hearts of Iron 4, no DLC, nothing. Just the free Polish update included. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what country do I choose? There's so many options. Well, if you've already played through the tutorial, you'll know that you have the option of playing Italy. If you feel comfortable doing that, by all means do so. I wouldn't recommend it though. Italy is a bit of a Instead, I recommend you pick Germany. Why Germany? 1. Germany is incredibly powerful, which means it's very forgiving if you make mistakes. You can almost always recover. And 2. Germany sets the pace for World War II, so you're not on a clock. You decide when things happen and when the fun begins. So I recommend your first few playthroughs to be with Germany. Let's go. This brings you to the map screen. This is also an alternate place where you can select your countries by simply clicking on them on the map. You can choose nations that were not in that list before, like Denmark, Norway, Turkey, Greece, but we'll stick with Germany for now. Down here, bottom right, we have a few more options. A difficulty slider going from civilian, where you get a bunch of bonuses as the player, all the way up to elite. If you really hate yourself, the AI will get buffs and the player will get debuffs. I recommend sticking with regular. Yes, you will not get all those buffs, but you will not use them as a crutch either. You will learn the game on the difficulty that it is meant to be played at. Other than that, there's some custom game rules here. I recommend you not look at those or not mess with those until you're more comfortable with the game. Next up, we have Iron Man mode. This locks you into a single save game for your entire playthrough, so no reloading if you make mistakes. This is also required for achievements. Personally, I always play on Iron Man mode because I've gotten used to it. You don't have to. I recommend even turning that off for your first couple of playthroughs so you can reload when things go wrong and you can use your mistakes as a learning experience. Next up, the historical AI focuses. This pretty much determines what the major nations in the world will do. With historical AI focuses on, something I recommend if you're just starting out, the world will follow its natural historical path towards World War II, with all the major players picking predetermined focuses so the world does not go off the rails. Trust me, once you turn this off, crazy things happen. Anyway, let's get going. But first, if you like these videos, leave a like, consider subscribing, and hit that bell icon to be notified whenever I upload more content. It really helps the channel out a lot, and all hail the glorious algorithm. That said, we've got enough nonsense here, time for the video. And that brings us to the first overview you get when you fire up a new game. If you're feeling intimidated by this, don't be. It's a lot easier than it looks, and I'll just walk you through the menus one by one so you know what they all represent, how to handle them, and just how to get a feel for the game. Let's start out with the country flag. This opens up the political tab. Has a nice picture of your country leader. If you mouse over it, you can see what that man does for your country. Mr. Schmittler here gives us additional political power gain. Very nice. Then we have the meat and potatoes of this screen, the national focus. We go in here and we get the national focus tree. All major powers in the world have a unique focus tree, and depending on what DLC you have, because DLC tends to add more focus trees and alter existing ones. So depending on what DLC you have active, these trees can be expanded, and minor powers also have access to a few trees through that DLC. Now, what do these things do? Well, they give you bonuses. They run for 70 days, mostly. Some run for 35 days, but most are 70 days, and upon completion, you get a certain bonus associated with them. Usually, trees are broken up into separate parts. For instance, the German tree has the 4-year plan. This leads into the industry part of the tree. Army innovations, air innovations, and naval rearmament lead into the military parts of the tree, and everything under Rhineland leads to the political parts of the tree. Now, for what focuses to pick and in what order to pick them, you can play the meta. There are a million guides and flowcharts out there that dictate what is the absolute best path to choose. For your first couple of games, just do whatever. You don't have to play this optimally as long as you're having fun and you're learning. For instance, as Germany, I can go with a 4-year plan, improving my industry, giving me access to a political advisor. That then unlocks Großbaumwirtschaft, I think, giving me more bonuses, or I can build the West Wall, a series of forts along the French border. I can go autarky, that is the focus on self-sufficient industry, essentially making my country stronger on its own. Or I can follow the Rhineland path, giving me access to the Anschluss, the historical annexation of Austria, down into the Sudetenland. I can demand that Czechoslovakia surrender the German-speaking Sudetenland to Germany. You can see these focuses set the historical path for the country. As it runs through the focuses, the game progresses towards the crescendo that is World War II. And some focus trees also offer alternative history. For instance, we can befriend Japan, like historically, or we can befriend China, which Germany did not do. We can befriend Czechoslovakia instead of demanding the Sudetenland. This offers up other opportunities down the line. Or we can do the unthinkable and go into an alliance with the USSR. So the focus trees offer many opportunities. I apologize for the dog in the background. Can't make him stop barking. It is what dogs do. But if you're interested in playing this freeform, a lot of fun here. If you just want the absolute best path here, I recommend you do a quick Google search. There's probably a billion guides out there that tell you exactly what focuses to pick in what exact order to get the most out of it. For Germany, I tend to go with 4-year plan first. Now, further on, we have the political situation in the country. A little pie chart here that says just how divided the nation is. Brown represents the fascists, blue represents the democratic parties, red represents the communists, and then you have gray, which is not represented in Germany, but these are the non-aligned parties. Think dictators without a clear ideology, or monarchies. And then there's also these buttons here. These are very important. These represent the various laws of your country. Conscription laws for manpower, trade laws for imports or exports, well, exports really. Economy laws to dictate just how much of your economy is dedicated to the war effort. And then a political cabinet giving you access to a few advisors that alter your country with bonuses. As you can see, they all cost roughly the same. Most will cost 150 political power. Political power is a resource that you gain on a daily basis. You gain a base value of 2 that can then be modified by certain modifiers like our country leader or the status of our stability. High stability means you get more political power, and it is spent in this window on those advisors, on those laws and other various things. It's also spent on decisions, but more on those later. And you will always be spending, or almost always be spending 1 political power a day of year 2, so half is going to be spent on focuses. When you have a focus active, it will cost 1 political power per day. So, well, I said it has a base value of 2 per day. Realistically, it's 1. Anyway, then you have research and production here. These are various design companies that give effects to equipment and give slight bonuses to researching that equipment to alter your playstyle just to fit you more closely. For instance, the industrial concern will improve the speed at which we research industrial technology. A tank designer will give our tanks certain bonuses if we research them with this designer active. So those little accents can change the outcome of the game in slight ways. And then finally, the military staff. You can have a chief of the army, navy, and air force. Once again, these provide bonuses to their branches of the military. An army offense expert gives your divisions more attack, for instance. And then there's the military high command. This is your army general staff. 3 advisors, much like the political advisors, they can be assigned to improve the effectiveness of your units and give flat out buffs to certain types of units depending on who you pick. For instance, the armor genius will affect armor divisions, but he will not have anything to do with the infantry. Same for the infantry expert. He buffs your infantry, but does nothing for your tanks. Then the next button over, our decisions tab. This is where we can spend some more of that excess political power. If we don't have anything to choose in the political tree, we can go into the decisions here and spend it on a few things. We can mostly affect the political situation of our country here by banning or promoting certain factions to either counteract what some other foreign power is doing to our politics, or we can choose for ourselves in case we want to change the political makeup of our country. This is where we can do that. Alternatively, what we can also do here is to influence the stability and war support in our country through means such as propaganda or improving our worker conditions. Worker conditions improves our stability, and stability can be found up here. Stability mostly affects our industry, so our industrial output is higher as our stability rises. And a good rule of thumb for stability is to keep it above 50%. Below 50%, you start incurring negative modifiers. Everything above 50% gives you a positive modifier. But not only that, if you find yourself at war, two things happen. One, you will lose a flat 30%. So in this case, we have 84% stability while at peace. If you were to instantly go to war without any changes, we would be cut down to 54% stability. So our bonuses would be reduced. If we were to fall below 50% stability while at war, we are also at risk of incurring a few events, notably the event called strikes. Something you don't want to see. It essentially cripples your industry, and the only way to get rid of it is to spend a lot of political power. So it's best avoided if you can. And then the war propaganda here, this will influence your war support. War support, much like stability, needs to be as high as possible, with 50% being the 0 point, anything below 50% giving you negative modifiers, everything above 50% giving you positive modifiers. And again, if you're at war with less than 50% war support, you will start getting negative events. Instead of the industry being affected, this will affect your manpower and your troops, as troops will desert because they no longer believe in the fight. And like stability, being at war also affects the number itself. Fighting an offensive war will give you a cut to the stability, I believe by 20 or 30%, I'm not sure. So if we were to go to war and be the aggressor, our 30% war support would actually be 0% war support or 10%. If on the other hand we are the defender, we will get a boost to our war support to simulate the people rallying to the cause, so that 30% would actually bump up to 60 or 50%. Once again, I'm not sure if it's 20 or 30. I'd have to look that up. I'm sorry. So in short, stability affects mostly the industry by giving you boosts or debuffs to it, whereas war support mostly affects the military situation by influencing the rate at which more men mobilize for recruitment, and also affecting the rate at which your country is willing to give up if you are starting to lose the war. And again, these are affected with decisions available to every country. Now, not all countries have access to the same decisions. Some are unlocked via focuses, some are very nation specific, like these MIFO builds. These are exclusive to Germany. You will discover more decisions as you play the game, but with this, you have the basics under your belt. And that brings us to research, one of the big things in the game. Opening this window shows you a couple of research slots that you have available to do actual research. Now, the amount of slots depends on the country you're playing. Most major powers start with 4 research slots, possibly unlocking more through the focus tree. Minor powers tend to start with 3, and some really small, really poor countries start with just 2 research slots. Now, what is research? We go into this. You can see a bunch of tabs up here, and each tab has a giant tree underneath it. Let me start off by saying, don't worry, you won't be researching all of this in every game. I'll give you the quick overview for what each tab does. The first tab here is your infantry. This has the basic equipment for your infantry, so anything from rifles to field equipment like mortars, etc. The further along in the timeline, the better the equipment generally. Next up, you have mobile infantry. This is where you find your trucks and your half-tracks. This is used for various different divisions, mostly motorized and quick divisions. We'll have a look at the divisions later, don't worry. And your special forces. Now, as a brand new player, you can pretty much ignore special forces. Special forces are limited divisions, you can't have a lot of them, and they are very good at specific tasks. For instance, Marines, really good for naval invasions or fighting across rivers. Mountaineers, they do what it says on the tin, they fight really well in mountains. And paratroopers are special in that they can be dropped from special airplanes and hit enemies behind their lines, giving you great strategic possibilities, but they're a little finicky to use. Plus, this tree also has some upgrades, various upgrades to special forces. So that's the infantry. For your first couple of games, you'll mostly be sticking to weapons and equipment, and maybe a bit in mobile infantry, the trucks. You'll definitely use the trucks The rest, not so much. Then we have the support companies. Well, once again, it does what it says on the tin. These support your divisions. These are a variety of different battalions or support battalions that you can attach to regular divisions to help them in the fight or help them through certain circumstances. You have your engineers. They will allow your troops to dig in, as represented by this entrenchment, a special stat, and they will give certain bonuses when fighting in certain types of terrain. Engineers are really good. I recommend you train and use engineers whenever you can. Then we have the recon companies. These are varied depending on what kind of vehicle you put them on. They can be on cavalry, they can be in trucks, they can be in armored cars, or they can be in light armor. I recommend sticking with cavalry recon for your first couple of playthroughs. It will be complicated enough as it is. What recon does is it gives your divisions a reconnaissance stat. It's basically a way for your commander, your general, to have an idea what the enemy's doing and react to it better. Overall, this is not a very impactful addition. I tend to skip this one. Then there's the military police. These help you occupy conquered land. Maintenance companies, these help keep your trucks from breaking down, and they help you capture enemy equipment. So if you are defeating the enemy, you can pick up some of their guns with this division. It's not terrible, it's not great, it has its uses. Usually this one is used to accompany tanks, because, you know, everyone who's seen a Panther knows that they tend to break a lot. And then there's a couple more underneath this tab. You can see it's a little bit outlined in an orange box. That means to access these three, you need access to the trucks, the Oberblitz. And first off, there's these field hospitals. What these do is allow for some of your casualties in the field to recover and actually heal up and rejoin the fight. It's not a huge amount, but it can help if you're suffering from manpower. And it also reduces the rate at which you lose experience, because as veterans die, they are replaced by fresh recruits, and the overall experience of a division will drop as it takes casualties. Being able to recover some veterans in a hospital and sending them back to the division counteracts that loss a little bit. Generally, I don't think these are useful unless you're really suffering from manpower. They have their uses. I wouldn't use them as a new player. Then there's the logistics companies. These reduce the amount of fuel and general supply that any division uses if these are attached to them. Very useful when fighting in terrain that is not exactly covered with railways and roads, so that has poor infrastructure, like Africa or vast parts of Asia, the Soviet Union. This is also a very good addition to any armored division because it will reduce the amount of fuel those units use. I'll talk about fuel in a minute. And then finally, we have the signal company here. That's in another yellow box. So to get signal companies, you need both trucks and radio technology. What signal companies do is provide initiative. It's basically allowing for your units to intercommunicate better, so that when one unit is forced to retreat out of combat or one unit starts combat, its friends can reinforce quicker because they know what's going on. That's one way to picture it. This affects how quickly a unit joins a fight. Definitely useful for fast units. And that brings us to armor. Another fun part of land combat is armored warfare. Here you have your divisions broken up into light armored, medium armor, and heavy armor, with modern battle tanks way at the bottom. Light tanks are notoriously fast and notoriously paper thin, so while at the start, when nobody's really using anything bigger than a pea shooter, these will do fine, but as the game progresses, the enemy will start using some anti-tank guns, and once the armor of a tank is pierced, its value is, well, let's say significantly lessened. That's where the medium tanks come in. They are a little slower, but have more armor, so they're a good middle of the road. They're also not as expensive as a heavy tank, but they're a little more expensive than a light tank, which brings us to the heavy tank, the big boys. These have massive armor, but are relatively slow, actually very slow, and they cost a great deal of resources to produce. Versus the AI, in single player, I do not recommend making heavy tanks, at least not at the start. Once you get a feel for the game and you know what you're doing, feel free to experiment, but I don't recommend doing this early on. I recommend sticking with lights or mediums. And then there's two more at the bottom. The modern tank, the modern main battle tank. It is completely separate from all other tanks. This one is in a class of its own. It's pretty much the best version of the tank available. Modern technology. By the time you get this, the game's pretty much over. And then you have the super heavy tank. It's there. I don't think a lot of people use it. It's extremely slow, slower even than a regular heavy tank. It has even thicker armor, but it's ridiculously expensive. I would just steer clear of this. This is Hitler's folly right here, the mouse. Panzerkampfwagen 8. Then onwards to the artillery. These are your regular artillery pieces, such as field artillery, anti-air guns, anti-tank guns, and rocket artillery. Once again, for single player and as a new player, I recommend steering clear of anti-tank and rocket artillery. Rocket artillery usually isn't worth it anyway. Yes, I say usually. Don't attack me in the comments with use cases for rocket artillery. It has its uses, but as a new player, it needlessly complicates things for you. As well as anti-tank, I wouldn't recommend making anti-tank because it's usually not required to defeat the AI. Actually, it's never required to defeat the AI. You can experiment with this if you want, but my experience is any industrial capacity spent on making and researching anti-tank is wasted. You're better off putting that work elsewhere. That leaves you with anti-air and artillery. Definitely keep artillery up to date as well as anti-air. These are very useful. And again, they do what they say on the tin. Artillery is good for blowing people up. It adds soft attack. Soft attack is what hits infantry hard, so artillery, really good at hitting them. As well as anti-air. This one shoots down airplanes, obviously. Plus, like the German Flak 88, it can also be pointed down, as represented by the piercing value here, to shoot tanks. And that's why anti-air is pretty good. If you add a little bit of anti-air to a division in the form of a support company, it can help you pierce some basic tank divisions. Then we come to the land doctrines. This is the overall strategy of your military high command. Here you can choose the flavor with which you wish to fight your wars. There's 4 options here, though in reality, I recommend you stick to 2 of them. 1, mobile warfare. This is for your fast units. If you're playing a country that is heavily specialized and geared towards tanks, like Germany, this is great. It makes your units faster, it buffs your tanks, it buffs your infantry. Overall, a really good tree. Then the second tree, superior firepower. This is the bread and butter of most nations that don't have big buffs to mobile warfare and don't want to use tanks all the time. Really, really good. This boosts your infantry, it boosts your artillery. It's a really great all-round doctrine. I recommend sticking with superior firepower if you're not playing Germany. And even if you are playing Germany, this one's also pretty good. That brings us to the last 2, Grand Battle Plan and Mass Assault. Grand Battle Plan is not a great doctrine. It is World War I style fighting, big trenches, wait until the enemy's done attacking, and then send your own wave of infantry or armor or whatever at them. It has its uses. It's very front-loaded, so the biggest strengths are at the early researches. So the first one here, giving you extra entrenchment. This is great if you're playing a country that has to defend itself very early on, like China, fighting off Japan, but it has a niche use. Same for Mass Assault, really. This is just throwing wave after wave of your own men at the enemy until they hit their kill counter and shut down. Especially going with mass mobilization, this just makes you throw men at the problem. It's generally not the best doctrine. It has its uses. Once again, there are niches where this is useful, but as a new player, steer clear of this one. If you're feeling more comfortable with the game and you want to experiment, be my guest. Then the naval tree. This is where you research your boats and your better boats and your best boats, as well as transports, allowing you to invade the enemy across the sea. Pretty straightforward. Same for the naval doctrines. These are ways to improve your navy in various specializations, such as trade interdiction is really good if you're building a submarine fleet or a raiding fleet designed to sink enemy convoys and strangle their trade and supply. Fleet in being is for building a big fleet and not actually using it. Well, that's not right. It's all about the battleships, the cruisers, the big boys, and force projection, where the base strike is all about your aircraft carriers and death from above. Now, the Navy is complicated for a beginner. You can safely skip most of this until you're more comfortable with the game. Then brings us to air. This allows you to research various airplanes. By and large, the split down the middle here is short range on the left, long range on the right. I recommend sticking with short range for now. That includes fighters, close air support, and naval bombers. Fighters give you control of the skies and shoot down enemy fighters and bombers. They fight fighters to get control of the sky, and then they shoot down bombers because, well, you have to protect the homeland and you have to protect your divisions. Fighters, always useful. very good. Close air support interferes in land combat. These are your Stuka dive bombers who dive down and attack enemy divisions. They interfere in ongoing combat and they can do a lot of damage to an enemy that does not have fighters to protect themselves or that does not have anti-air guns to shoot down close air support. This is why anti-air is pretty great. And then finally, naval bombers. Pretty obvious, they sink enemy ships. And the further down you go, the more advanced those airplanes become. On the other side, we have the heavy fighters, tactical bombers, and strategic bombers. Strategic bombers are your big flying beasts. They do the carpet bombing of enemy industry. Tactical bombers are a bit of a mix between close air support, naval bombers, and strategic bombers. They're slightly smaller than a strategic bomber, but they can do everything that all those other airplanes can. And before I forget, heavy fighters are a long-range version of the fighter. They're good, yes, but they are expensive to the point that it's better to just make more regular fighters. Again, once you feel more comfortable with the game, feel free to experiment with this, but early on, I don't recommend making these. Bringing us to the air doctrines, these are pretty straightforward. Strategic destruction tends to buff your strategic bombers. Battlefield support tends to favor your close air support and interfering in land combat, and operational integrity tends to favor tactical bombers and is a bit of a mix between the first two. My personal preference goes to either strategic destruction or battlefield support, but I'll leave you free to choose. You can't really go wrong here in the single player experience. Don't worry, we're almost there. This is our engineering tab, again split into two major parts. The right side, atomic research and experimental rockets, is fancy stuff, late game stuff. You probably won't be using these. By the time you can research these at a reasonable pace, the game is almost over anyway, and their impact is minimal, especially for experimental rockets. Atomic research could be cool with, you know, the nuke, but you don't need these to win. I would ignore them if I were you for now. They're fun to play with, but absolutely unnecessary. Electronic engineering, however, is vital. The first one unlocks the tree with a left and a right side. The left side is radios and various types of radar. Radio is very, very important. You know, units with a radio are better at coordinating their stuff. Radar is situational. You can build this if you like. It has its uses. I wouldn't focus on it too much. The other part here under mechanical computing, all the way down here to advanced computing machine, this is the development of the computer. Sort of. This boosts your research speed. I definitely recommend keeping this up to date at all times. It's very important. These help you research everything else quicker. And then finally, we're almost there, the industry. Split into a couple of major parts: production, basic industry, construction, and synthetic oils. Production adds production efficiency cap. You'll see what that means in a bit when we talk about production. Basic idea is to keep this up to date. It's very important to always have the most modern version of this researched. Same with industry. You can either go with concentrated industry or dispersed industry. Both have their uses, and the difference between both is so small that for single player, most of the time, 99.9% of the time, doesn't matter what you pick. You choose, do whatever you want, doesn't matter. If you want my opinion, I really like dispersed industry. And like production, industry is very important. Keep this up to date at all times if you can. Then there's construction. Each tier of construction allows you to build things quicker. Pretty obvious. It's also paired with a new technology of excavation for each tier of construction. That pretty much just allows you to extract your resources more efficiently. If you have the time, research it, but it's not vital. Then finally, the last bit, synthetic oil. The first tier, fuel storage, allows you to build fuel silos. Just disregard that, not important. What's important is it allows you to do the other techs. I'll start with the right one first. It allows you to get fuel refining. Essentially what this does is allow you to get fuel more efficiently. Fuel is automatically generated from oil, and the higher your fuel refining, the more fuel you get for each point of oil, and the more fuel you get from your refineries. What are refineries? That's what you get with this one. It allows countries that don't naturally have access to oil to sort of produce their own oil and in that way also produce their own fuel. That's very important because not everyone won the geographical lottery and has access to large oil supplies like the Soviet Union or Romania. And as the wars drag on, you will not be able to trade with everyone in the world, and not everyone is just going to be willing to give away the fuel and oil that they need themselves. So synthetic oil experiments are pretty important for countries like Germany. And as you go down this tree, you can improve the effectiveness of those refineries by making them produce more fuel or produce a little bit of rubber as a byproduct. Rubber, always good, because you need rubber to build, well, trucks and airplanes. And that is the basic research done. Now, if you're wondering, how do I start with this? What do I do? What do I research first? Basic opener is almost always the same. You focus on industry and engineering first. What that results in is you start researching basic machine tools, you start researching construction, and you start researching electronic engineering. Once those finish and open up the rest of the tree, you start getting the rest of this entire tree up to date until you hit this. You see the red text here. It says that the technology is ahead of time. So you keep researching until you see the red text, technology is ahead of time, and then you switch out to something else. Keep the industry up to date, keep the engineering up to date, or at least the computing part of the engineering, so the right branch. And when those are up to date, you can start playing around with your infantry equipment for your basic infantry, or your armor so you can get better tanks, or even some of your doctrine work if you want to make your army more effective overall. The choice is yours, really. There's not much you can do wrong here. Feel free to experiment. Personally, I just tend to go with the infantry equipment first. And next up, that brings us to diplomacy. Don't worry about this window. You can safely ignore that. Just right-click your own country and see nothing. However, now we'll right-click a different country, and there we go. We have a bunch of possible interactions with that country. Most, if not all of these, cost political power. As you can already tell by now, we need political power quite a lot. So we get a bit of information about the country as well. We can see the national spirits they have, any possible relationships they have with other countries. And if our intel is high enough, we can see what focus they are doing. Right now, all we know about France is that they're not doing any national focuses, which makes sense. The game hasn't technically started yet. If we were to start the game, they will set a focus. I'll let the day tick by. And there we go. We can see that France is forming the Popular Front. And if we have enough intel, we can even see what they've done before that focus. Obviously, since this is the first one, there's not going to be anything else here. It's also a good place to check out other countries' focus trees. This is the French one, for instance. It's quite extensive. And with La Resistance, it gets even chunkier. Now, the most important interactions with countries are justifying a war goal, allowing you to go to war, and declaring war, allowing you to use that war goal we just created to attack an enemy. That's right, you have to come up with a reason before we can attack someone. We can't just walk in. It's part of Paradox's whole diplomatic style, so if you've ever played a Paradox game before, you've pretty much figured this out by now. If not, here's the basics. You justify a war goal. When it's done, you declare the war. That's how it works. Other interactions here are fairly straightforward. We can guarantee the independence of other countries, allowing us to defend them if they are attacked. We can ask and offer military access. We can sign pacts of non-aggression, promising not to attack each other, invite each other to a faction, sending lend-lease, so we send guns to another country who is currently fighting. We can do the same with volunteers. Many options here, and even some espionage nonsense. We can boost party popularity, influencing a country's politics so that our current ruling party has friends in their country. This can destabilize other countries, and we can also stage coups. This, combined with boosting that party popularity, can lead to some pretty hilarious results. I recommend you experiment with this. It can be fun, but it's not vital. This is something you can put aside until you're more comfortable with the game. Other things here are the details. The details tell you a lot about another country. For instance, we can see what laws they're currently on. This is a good indication of just how desperate the fighting has become for them, as well as seeing how many divisions, a rough estimate, the enemy is fielding. And the higher your intel, the more you know about a country. Right now, we know that France has between 47 and 108 divisions. That's a pretty big gap. If our intel gets higher, we can narrow that down until we eventually get an exact number. And the same goes for their military factories, their dockyards, their civilian factories. We can even estimate how many airplanes they have, and how much manpower they have in reserve. This is all very, very interesting, and information is key if you're going to fight any war effectively. And moving on, that brings us to trade. Don't worry, when you open up this screen, you might panic and see a lot of countries here, a lot of numbers, and they don't make any sense. Just take a deep breath, then realize most of this doesn't matter. I'll give you a quick overview of trade. Why do we need to trade? We need resources to produce equipment, and chances are you will not have access to every resource required, and even if you do, you'll probably not have enough within your own territory, meaning imports. The same goes for exporting your own stuff. Depending on your trade laws, a certain amount of your produced resources are set aside and are made available for other countries to import. Imports work at a ratio of 1 civilian factory for 8 resources. I'll show you with a practical example. That also leads us into the second most important thing, the color system. With the exception of oil, everything here is colored depending on the situation. A green number means great, we have all the resources we need. A red number means we need some stuff, please import. And a yellow number means we have everything we need and we're still importing more. So why? So let's fix that and I'll show you the numbers. For instance, let's fix our rubber. If we click on the rubber resource, that gives us a list of countries we can trade with, ranked from those who have the most available to the lowest number. Now, say we want some of that rubber because we need some, right? Let's click on the Dutch East Indies in the list. And here you can see we will give them 1 civilian factory, and in exchange, we will buy 8 rubber. This is the normal ratio. This is how it works. This is also how it works with the AI buying your stuff. They get 8 of a resource. In exchange, you have access to 1 of their civilian factories. It's a give and take, a two-way street. And that leads us into the third important thing, convoys. If trade cannot be done entirely by land, you will need to go via sea. For instance, the Dutch East Indies. Where are they? Well, there are a bunch of islands here, so it's not possible to get a land route there. It is possible to get a land route with their neighbor, British Malaya, because they are on the tip of this peninsula here. So if we were to trade with British Malaya, we need no convoys. The reason being is there is no hostile country between us and British Malaya at this time. If, for instance, Siam here were to be hostile, there would be no land route possible between our two countries and we would still have to use convoys to trade with them. But we don't, so we won't. That's pretty much all you need to know about trade. Oh, and in case you want to fix the yellow number, again, click on the resource, go find a country you're trading with, in this case Sweden, and stop the trade by either using the slider or by clicking this button here that will automatically set the exact amount of factories we need to be trading for. In this case, that's 0. So that is trade in a nutshell. It's really not that complicated. And that brings us to construction, another very, very important part of the game. This is where we will do our building. And what can we build? Well, we can build a lot of different things. We can build infrastructure. What does infrastructure do? It increases the rate at which units can move through a province. It increases the rate at which you can build in that province, because, well, everything is more efficiently connected, things run better. It improves the base fuel capacity of a state. Don't worry about it too much. And, very big thing, the higher the infrastructure level in an area with resources, like say the Rhineland here, if we build up the infrastructure, we can extract more of those resources. So infrastructure, pretty big deal. What else can we build? We can build air bases where you can put your air forces. We can build static anti-air to deter enemy bombers. We can build radar stations if we have the technology. And then the important bits are here in the center. We can build military factories. What do military factories do? Military factories produce our equipment, so our guns, our tanks, our trucks. That's what military factories do. We can build civilian factories, and those are used for building factories and trading for resources, but most importantly, building factories. Then there's our naval dockyards. They build ships, synthetic refineries. They can produce oil out of thin air for those nations without access to it. Fuel silos, not that important, but they can increase the amount of fuel you can hold on to. So you could theoretically build up a big stockpile before going to war and then slowly use that up so you're not that dependent on trade. We have 2 minor things here. The rocket sites, I wouldn't worry about these too much. The nuclear reactor, this starts producing nuclear weapons for you, but ironically, I wouldn't worry about this too much. It's so late game, you'll probably not use it, especially not as a new player. And then on to naval bases. Naval bases are what you could call ports. It's where your ships dock and where trade and supply routes can connect to your country. These range from level 1 to 10, and the higher the level, the more efficient they can operate in terms of importing resources and supply throughput, and the more ships can be repaired at that dockyard. Then there's also land forts and coastal forts. They do what you think they do. Land forts give you a defensive bonus in land combat, and coastal forts give you a defensive bonus if the enemy tries to attack that tile from the sea. So these are pretty good in combination with naval bases. And then finally, we can also convert one type of factory to another, so civilian into military and vice versa. This has some use cases, but as a new player, I wouldn't worry about this too much. Now, how would you go about building? What order do you build in? You just start churning out military factories or civilian factories. Well, without going too much in depth, there's two things you need to take into account. One, what is your current mobilization law? Because if you start on civilian economy, you have to take into account, you will take construction speed penalties to both military and civilian factories. If you're stuck on civilian economy and it doesn't look like you'll be getting rid of it anytime soon, I would recommend you build some infrastructure in places that have resources or in your capital region to improve the supply in the region. And after those are done, you can start building some civilian factories or military factories depending on what you need. I can't tell you that in advance, but usually the priority is civilian factories until about a year before World War II starts. After which, we start the buildup of military factories and synthetic refineries if we are using a lot of oil for our country, like Germany. Germany is going to use a lot of oil, trust me. The other buildings, I wouldn't worry about too much, not as a new player. They're not that important. Infrastructure, civilian and military factories will see you a long way. Build some dockyards if you want to fiddle with the navy, and you can build or improve naval bases if you want, but you don't really have to. Germany already has pretty good bases. Now, how does construction work in a technical sense? Well, we select the building that we want to build, in this case civilian factories, and then we choose the state in which to build them. How do we choose the state that we build in? We look at the infrastructure. The higher the infrastructure in a province, the faster things are built there. So that is where we prioritize our building. In this case, Brandenburg, Westphalen, the Rhineland, and Württemberg. Now you see me doing a lot of clicking here. You could do that. Click one at a time, right click to remove, click to add, or you can just shift click to add as many as you can and shift right click to remove everything. You can see here 15 factories are working to build the first one, 7 factories are working to build the second one, no factories are working on the others. So for construction, a maximum of 15 civilian factories can work on one project at a time. The more factories you have, the more of these queues will continue to run alongside each other, speeding up construction. And the reason why you want to start out with as many civilian factories as you can before you shift over to military factories is the more factories you have available for construction, the quicker you can do construction. So in the time where you're not really needing a lot of equipment, you can spend that making factories that will make you factories that will make you equipment. It's a bit of a snowball effect, if you get what I mean. And next up, another screen that you'll be staring at for quite some time. Production. This is where the magic happens. This is where all the guns, tanks, artillery, airplanes, boats, you name it, if you can produce it, this is where you do it. Production is done by selecting the equipment you want to make and then assigning a set of factories to them. As you can see here, we are making 53 and a bit of infantry equipment per day. The more factories we assign to them, the higher that number. Now, that goes for all other equipment. If you research the equipment, this is where you start producing it. How much of everything you need to make will depend on your strategy and the type of unit you're using. I can't hold your hand here, but let me just say the basics that you will always be making is infantry equipment for your infantry, support equipment for your support companies. You'll pretty much always be making towed artillery because it's just really good. And then extra stuff, a nice little bonus are tanks, lights, mediums or heavies, motorized equipment for a variety of reasons. And then you have your aircraft. Fighters and close air support are pretty useful as a new player. Tactical bombers, I would hold off with these until you're a little more experienced. They have their uses, but they're a bit of a niche. And then there's the boats. Now the Navy might seem like a big deal in Hearts of Iron 4. I wouldn't worry about it too much for your first couple of playthroughs. Definitely as Germany, you can let these finish or you can end the run by clicking the trash can here. Doesn't really matter. I would just let them build, put them all together in one giant fleet, and forget about them until we need them. Now, a few pointers about factories. 1. The more factories you start assigning to things, the less of an overview you'll have, so you have some options here to make it a little easier on the eyes. For now, look at the infantry equipment. We have 15 factories assigned, the maximum. Or at least it looks like the maximum. We can still press the button, but we're not seeing the factories. So to make that a little more visually appealing, we can hit the X5 or the X10, and factories are now grouped in groups of 5 or 10. It's a lot easier on the eyes this way. And to illustrate another point, I'll start a new run of infantry equipment and just put it up there so you can compare the two. The new run, the new line, has a big red bar up there. That means it's not running at peak efficiency. Efficiency is set at a maximum of 50%, give or take, and it's influenced by technology and certain national spirits. Better your production technology, the better your production efficiency cap, and you can start making these things a lot more efficiently and quickly. As you assign fresh factories to a production line or start up new production lines, they start out with a very poor production efficiency. To simulate the fact that the factories are starting up, the workers have to be trained. Not everything is being done optimally yet. They still have to figure out a few kinks, and this also means that you can't just take 5 factories out of infantry equipment, put 5 factories into artillery, and those factories will be working just as efficiently. No, it doesn't work like that. There will always be a little bit of a ramp-up time required to be working at peak efficiency. So this really rewards strategic planning. You have to plan ahead. What is my overall goal? How am I going to achieve it? What am I going to need? And work towards that. As you play the game, you'll start to notice that, ooh, I have like tons of infantry equipment, but I don't have enough artillery. I should probably make more artillery. And for your next following games, you will know ahead of time that, right, I'm going to be lacking artillery. Probably I'm going to put a few more factories on that. It's a learning experience. You'll see as time progresses. For a basic Germany game, this is how I like to start my production. I don't know if it's optimal. It's just my personal preference. A few airplanes, fighters, close air support, some motorized. I'll leave one factory building light tanks because I tend to transfer out of light tanks relatively early on into mediums. Germany has that power. And just a variety of equipment that I will need for my infantry and other divisions. You can use this as your base to start from and then adapt as the game progresses. And don't worry, we're almost through those menus. Next up is recruit and deploy. And considering this is a military game, you'll probably use this menu quite a bit. This is where we do many things. Let's just go over them one at a time. First off, you can set the priority for equipment in regards to reinforcing existing units, upgrading existing units, special operations, but disregard this if you do not have the La Resistance DLC. It does nothing if you don't have that DLC, I believe. And getting equipment to garrisons. This is also quite important. If you start recruiting a unit, you can also set the priority for equipment to those units. My advice is high priority on reinforcements and garrisons, low on upgrades and operations. Well, medium on upgrades works just fine. And then on fresh recruits, just leave it on medium priority, unless you really need those units before you give fresh guns to your existing army. As for recruitment as Germany, I tend to just queue up a few infantry divisions, 10 or so, and leave them running an infinite number. I can also set them to do it once, twice, 3 times, etc., or just leave them to continuously train those units. One is done and they'll immediately start on the next one. You can also choose where these units are deployed. I prefer to park them outside my capital, or if you're at war, it's also a good idea to put them somewhere near the border so they don't have to make a very large trek. And when you're recruiting these units, these 2 bars here will slowly fill up. The left bar shows the amount of equipment the units still require and how much they've already received. This one needs to be full. And the right bar will show the amount of training a unit has had all the way until the bar fills. And if both bars are full, the unit will automatically deploy where you want them to deploy. You could speed this up by pressing this arrow here Once a unit reaches 20% of its training level, so 20% of the second bar is full, then you can click this arrow and that rushes the unit, so they will not be as well trained. It's very likely that they will not have all of their equipment yet, but it's a great way to get units out the door quickly if you're in a hurry. And there's one more thing you can do with the army, but I need to assign a general first. While we're here, let's take a look at all these units on the field. Quite intimidating, isn't it? 30 divisions. Alright, I'll show you a few tricks to manage them. First off, we can click this button here, unassigned divisions. This one pops up every time you have an army unit that isn't assigned to a general. Just left clicking it will go to a unit that is currently unassigned. If we shift left click it, we select all units currently unassigned. To make it easy on ourselves, let's assign them to a new army by clicking the small shadow puppet with a plus here. That creates an army. I like to organize my armies as well, so I want to put my divisions separate. Infantry goes into a separate army. Mobile units or special units go into separate armies. Now we could individually move over infantry divisions one at a time. That's super tedious. We could also left click holding shift and select units that way. It's a little less tedious, but still, it's a lot of clicking. No, what instead we can do is find those infantry divisions and double click. And then we select every division that shares that division's makeup. So all identical divisions will be selected. And then we just right click the portrait of the other army that we want them in, and we move all those divisions. Now those divisions are in an army. And now we have all those units selected, and we can easily select all of them by clicking on the portrait now. Great, so we have all those units. How do we control them? We could manually make them go places by right-clicking different provinces, but that's a bit tedious, isn't it? No, let's instead use the battle plans and AI orders. There's two types of front lines we can draw. The front line, the regular old front line, and this will put them on the border with a neighboring country. Either we simply click. As you can see, they are automatically redeploying to take up position along the border. That's great. Now I'm going to quickly delete this order. So hit the trash can and click the order, and I'll show you how to make frontline orders slightly differently. Instead of left clicking, we can right click and drag to set a custom length for the order. This is easier to manage if you have multiple armies on the same border. Your choice, it's just easier to manage things this way. Anyway, back to our recruit and deploy, and we can now click this gray button next to the location. What this does is allow us to automatically assign all freshly produced units to go to certain armies. If we were to assign them to our purple army here, that would mean every fresh division out of basic training will go and sit on the front line. We can't do that with the blue army because the blue army doesn't have any orders. Nothing in the blue army is assigned to anything, so we cannot assign fresh divisions there. I think it's a slight oversight on the developer's part. It would be easy if that was possible, but it's not, so hey. Let's give the blue army an order instead, and let's not park them on the border, just to show you that there's another order we can click. And that's called the fallback line. The fallback line is essentially the same thing as a frontline order, except it's not on the border with another country, and it cannot be used to attack from automatically. So what do? We hit that button, fallback line, and right click and drag to set fallback line, and the units will go and stand on that automatically. As you can see, they are all redeploying. That is basic army management. Don't worry about the templates. This is a rather complicated subject. It's not too difficult, but it may be a bit overwhelming to take it all in at the same time. So I've made a separate video about division design for single player. You can check that out in the link in the description below. And just to get you up and running, I'll throw you a few division templates that you could use moving forward in single player. I'll give you a defensive infantry template, an offensive infantry template, and an offensive tank template. And a few key pointers here for divisions. This is the most important stat you'll run into: combat width. You want this to be multiples of 10. So either 10 combat width, 20 combat width, or 40 combat width. 30 is not easy to do math with. Just stick to 10, 20, and 40. 10 is good for reserve divisions that are not expected to do a lot of fighting. 20 is excellent for defensive divisions that are just there to take hits and defend the front. And 40 is best used for divisions designed purely to attack. Now, for your infantry, what you want to use is one of these boys. 10 infantry battalions, and add the support companies you like. I recommend using support anti-air, support artillery, and engineer companies. These will do just fine as frontline fodder. They are excellent on the defense, not that great on the offense, but these are your fodder. This will be the bulk of your army. And for your armor, this is a good goal to strive for: 40 combat with 13 tanks and 7 trucks. This is very capable and it will make mincemeat out of the AI. Downside is it's going to require a lot of tanks to build, and it also requires quite a bit of army experience to be able to even create the template. But don't worry, there's ways to get army experience that don't require actual fighting, so you can get these before you start the actual wars. But more on that later. Anyway, that was basic recruit and deploy. On to the final screen here, the logistics. This will show you how much equipment you have in stock, or how big your deficit is, how many you're making every day, how many you are using every day, and down here we can also use this to prioritize the fuel in case we have a problem with fuel. All in all, it's not a screen you'll be staring at much. It's good to check if you have any problems in terms of logistics, and it will be a great indication of how poorly you're doing by how big the red numbers are. And with that, we've pretty much covered the most important of the menus. You already know what political power is, same for stability and war support. That brings us to manpower. This is how many available recruits there are. These are units, well, men, that you can draft into the army. You can increase this by conquering more core territory, or by conquering territory flat out, or by levying steeper and steeper conscription laws. Do be aware though, those come at a price. It's very important never to run out of manpower. Without fresh manpower, you cannot replenish losses and your units will slowly start to die. Next button here. Nice. Just shows you how many factories you have available of every type. Then we have our fuel. Fuel is used by the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And without fuel, mechanized or motorized units will not operate at a, well, peak capacity. They will effectively be garbage without fuel. So always make sure you have enough fuel in reserve, or you are importing or producing enough oil that you can turn into fuel. This is also where you can see just how much you're making, how much you're using, and where the problem lies. Next up, convoys. These are used for trade across the water and supplying your territories across water that are not connected via land connection. The enemy will sink these when you're at war, so always make sure to have enough of them. You can produce them in the production screen under the Navy. Then there's command power. This allows your generals to make certain strategic moves. It's not that important. You probably won't be using those a lot, especially if you're a newer player. Next up, army experience. We can get army experience via either fighting ourselves by sending guns to someone who is at war, and for some reason that makes us more experienced. I don't know, just roll with it. Or by exercising our units. How do we exercise our units? You select your army and you hit this button here. Simply left clicking it will make them continuously exercise until you tell them to stop. If you shift click the button, which we can't do right now, those units will exercise until every unit in the army is at level 3 in terms of experience. But since all these units are already at level 3, we can't do that. Do note that exercising costs equipment via attrition. If your units are exercising, guns are going to break, equipment's going to go missing, so don't overdo it. That's why shift clicking this button is so good. Army experience is used primarily to change your division templates, like I showed you earlier. It's also used to improve certain types of equipment like tanks. Then there's Navy experience. We can get this either via naval combat or by exercising our Navy, and it's used to speed up certain naval researches. And finally, air experience, pretty much the same as Navy experience. You get it via air combat or by exercising your planes, and they are used to either improve our planes or boost our air doctrine research speeds. And with that, I think I've explained the basics of it. Let's move. Now, with the basic UI and game mechanics explained to you, let's get into Hearts of Iron 4. Right now, we have 2 armies at our disposal. Units are grouped into armies, and these armies need leaders. As you can see, these shadow portraits are not much to look at. So let's assign some commanders. To do that, we select the army we wish to give a commander to. Let's take the infantry here and click up there, click to assign. This opens up a list of available commanders. As you can see, Germany starts with quite an extensive list, and if you should find yourself lacking commanders, you can always get another one for some political power, of course. Now, how do you go about choosing your commander? There are a few things you need to take into account. Each commander has certain traits. A brilliant strategist has more attack and planning. Panzer leader or armor officer will gain more experience if he is commanding tank troops. Similarly, an infantry officer will gain more experience when leading infantry. He is an infantry officer. I think he is also the most experienced infantry officer I can find, and I will assign him to the infantry army. Now, of course, there are more stats on a general than just the traits under their name. We have the stats for attack and defense. They are pretty straightforward. They increase the attack and defense of the units under their command. There is planning, which improves the speed at which planning occurs. I'll talk about that in a bit. And also the maximum amount of extra planning they can get. And finally, supply consumption. This is a pretty big one. This will affect the supply consumption, obviously, of all units under their command. And this can actually end up being rather important. So, generally, you want the best general available to command your armies, and you can arrange them so that your elite generals command your elite divisions while the chaff controls the fodder. Now, we've looked at the basic frontline orders, as we've set one in Poland here right now. But a frontline order is only the first step. We can follow that up with an offensive line. This one is simple. We click the button and then we draw an arrow in enemy territory. What this will do is give the general the order to attack in that direction all the way until that line that we drew here, and he will do his best to achieve those goals depending on the level of aggression that he is given. And aggression can be determined by these arrows here. They can either be very careful, the AI will try and only advance when it knows it will win combat, or when it sees open tiles that it can occupy without overextending its line. The opposite of that is aggressively execute battle plans. The AI will try to constantly attack, push. This has downsides and upsides. The upside is if you are winning, this will keep pushing the enemy back, never really giving them a chance to recover. However, this is also incredibly costly because of your continued combat. Your units risk taking a lot of damage. Your units risk pushing ahead too far and being cut off when the enemy finally gets around to counterattacking. And finally, there is the risk of gaps appearing in your line because your general is so aggressive in his attack that he might end up overextending. And then finally, we have the balanced method. It's a mix of the two. It's generally the best, I'd say. I'd either use balanced or aggressive if you know you're going to win. Just stick with balanced for now. What will happen now? These units who are assigned to this battle plan will start getting what's called planning. Planning is the bar just to the right of their experience bar. It's this tiny blue bar here. It's starting to fill up as some time progresses, and what this does is give a certain percentage of extra attack, up to a maximum set by the base of 30%, and whatever the general adds on top of that, there are other stats that could help. This will fill up until the unit moves, until the order changes, or until the order is given to execute the attack. Once the attack starts, it will slowly start to drain until all the planning is gone and the units no longer have the advantage of extensive planning because no plan survives contact with the enemy. To the right, you will see a shovel and shield. That indicates that the unit is entrenched. Consider it a bit like a defensive version of planning. This is also a bar that can fill up to a certain maximum that is influenced by research and certain support companies and even certain generals. This will increase the defensiveness of a unit and allow them to withstand enemy attacks easier. It's incredibly powerful, but the moment a unit moves, entrenchment is removed and will need to be rebuilt from scratch once they arrive in a new position. So it is definitely not a great idea to move units around a lot if you're expecting an attack anytime soon. Generals can do a few more orders than just these basic ones. We have what's called a naval invasion order. This one is very dependent on technology. Let me show you. The technology for that can be found under the naval tree under transports. Every tech of transports unlocked will allow a certain amount of units to be assigned as naval invasions and will impact the speed at which those invasions are planned. Currently, The very first technology allows for 10 units, 10 individual divisions, to be assigned as a naval invasion. How does a naval invasion work, you say? Well, you simply select the naval invasion order. It will highlight all available ports that you can use to launch your invasion from. Let us pick Wilhelmshaven here. And now we simply choose a destination. For instance, Norway, around Kristiansand. We can just right-click the port, and then these units, the ones we will assign to the order, will try to naval invade Kristiansand, the port. Generally, ports are defended by the AI, definitely by players, but by the AI, they are usually defended, so it's always a good idea to not just attack the port, but attack the tiles next to the port, as this will allow those units to land relatively unopposed and then come and help the units that are invading the port tile. Now, when we assign a division to this, we can see that it will take 3 convoys for a single division, depending on the size of that division, to get across the water, as well as a preparation time of 7 days to get everything in order. Now, if we assign a second unit to this, you can see that this has pretty much doubled. So up to a maximum of 70 days right now, because we can assign 10 units. With all 10 units assigned, we need 30 convoys and 70 days. Now, 70 days is a long time, and I'll show you a quick workaround. What you can also do is launch smaller naval invasions simultaneously. You're not limited to just the one naval invasion. Your only real limit is the amount of divisions that can be assigned to naval invasions simultaneously. So my personal preference is launch naval invasions of 2 divisions. So I'll send 2 to the port. I'll set up a new naval invasion order from the same port with 2 different units, and I'll land next to the port. Then I take 2 more divisions and do the same thing and land on the other side of the port. That way we can get maximum coverage of that port, so we can attack it very ferociously. And we keep doing that until we have used up all our available divisions. Now, as you can see, this is about 5 naval invasion orders. I use 2 divisions for each, and yes, this is a much longer list, but it will still take the same amount of convoys. That doesn't change, but this way we are ready in 14 days instead of waiting for the full 70 days. Just a little tip for you if you ever want to naval invade things. Then another order is the paratroop order. Very powerful. Bit difficult to explain without having access to paratroopers, and it's very risky. I don't recommend you try this in your initial playthroughs. Get comfortable with basic combat first, then try the paratrooper memes. They're very powerful, they're hilarious, the AI doesn't know how to handle them, but you need to have a bit of experience under your belt before you start memeing it up. We've already talked about the fallback line. This is essentially an order where you can place your units wherever, and they will stay there, or try to stay there. And then we have the area defense order. This is what you can consider to be a garrison. If we click that, it will also wipe away everything else that we've set, so be careful when doing this. And we can start clicking provinces, and what the AI will do is start garrisoning those provinces, and it will specifically start to garrison the things up here that we have selected. It will try to guard forts unless we tell it not to. Air bases, we can turn that off. It will try to guard the entire coastline. Usually I turn this off as well, because, well, it's a lot of coastline, and that leaves us with guarding victory points. This can be handy. And finally, guard naval bases. This is the main use of this feature in single player. The AI will then move its divisions onto those naval bases and defend them. You can also see how many divisions the general would require to execute that order. Oh, 2 more things I forgot. How many divisions can a general handle? 24 divisions, unless he has a special trait. I'm not sure if that is Waking the Tiger only, or if that's in the base game, but just assume a general commands 24 divisions, unless, one exception, he is working an area defense order. If he's working an area defense order, he can command 72 divisions. This is handy if you want to leave large armies to defend the coast. And since generals are not the highest of our military ranks, we can go 1 higher. We can simply select the army, and then click the plus button here, New Army Group. It's the leftmost one. The rightmost one will assign a new army. The leftmost one will assign a new army group. An army group is to generals what a general is to a division. It's just a way of grouping several armies under someone else's banner. Again, we can assign a commander, but as you can see, we are much more limited in our selection. These are all grayed out because they are just generals. An army group is commanded by a Field Marshal. And Field Marshals are a little different. They provide bonuses to everyone under their command. Don't worry. You can get fresh Field Marshals by promoting generals. This will require a bit of command power, so you're not stuck with the ones you start the game with. Now, Field Marshals can execute the same orders that a general can. For instance, you can simply set a front line, and the Field Marshal will organize all his armies along the front. In this case, there's just the one army. If we were to add the second general there, and if we set a frontline order with the general, he will organize his armies along the front to divide them more or less equally, as you can see here. If you're feeling a little desperate, or if there's just too much stuff to manage, you can do the same but hold shift while you click, and the Field Marshal will assign all those units to the same front line, but he will not care what army they are in. He will simply distribute them all along the front. As you can see, it's just the Field Marshal's color you can see now instead of the individual army colors. And that is basic army command. With that, you know how to invade an enemy. We have others here as well. Let's start with the Air Force. To select your Air Force, you can either go to the Air Overview and individually select Air Wings. I'm not a fan of this. You could also just hit F3, go to the Air Map, and just drag the box over and select everyone. This is a lot easier. Now, to organize your Air Wings. Well, this is a bit chaotic. What I always like to do is just select everything that the AI has deployed at the start of the game and delete them. Don't worry, the planes are not gone, the pilots are not gone, everything simply returns to our stockpile. They just put the planes in storage until we need them again. There, that's a lot cleaner, and we can organize from here. What I do next is find a nice big airfield or an airfield close to the front line, or where I know the front line will be, and I start putting my airplanes out there. To do that is select the airfield and hit the plus here, the plus and the airplane, and add a new air wing. That will take us to this window where we can select what planes we want in our air wing. There are some limitations here. You cannot make multiple air wings at the same time, so you can only make a wing of fighters, or a wing of CAS, or a wing of bombers. Pretty much just one wing of one type of airplane. Take fighters for once. We could just move all the equipment, but that's a pretty annoying number to work with. No, it's much easier and allegedly better to work with air wings the size of 100 airplanes, and to do that, shift click this button to move 100 airplanes, and there. Now we click OK, and it says here deploying from reserves. That means 100 airplanes and their pilots are being prepared to be ready, and they should be here in 2 days. Now you could do that one after another until you have all your air wings deployed, or if you're feeling a bit lazy, simply select the air wing that's coming out and hit this button, duplicate, and you will make an exact copy of that air wing with all the airplanes you have available to put up. Air wings will also use the most up-to-date equipment available to them, so if you put out 100 biplanes and then you start making BF-109s, every time a BF-109 is made available, they will retire one of the old airplanes and put that new plane into commission. That way, the Air Force is always using the best equipment. And the same thing we did with the fighters, we can do with the close air support. Now, how do we use the airplanes, you say? Well, it's fairly easy and straightforward. There's two ways. One, you select your fighters, you select the mission you want them to do. Air superiority means they will actively fight over the sky, and if there's time, they will shoot down bombers. Or you set them to interception. That means they will try to avoid enemy fighters, but they will throw everything they have at enemy bombers and close air support. Generally, I prefer to go with air superiority, unless I leave my fighters behind away from the front to defend my industrial heartland, and that's when I set them to interception. So, set them to air superiority, and simply right-click the air zone that you want them to fight over. And if those airplanes are active, you will see that big arrow there, and an icon saying how many fighters are active on that specific mission. Same goes with close air support. We can set them to close air support, to naval strike, or to port strike. Close air support means they will intervene in land combat. Naval strike cannot be done over land. You have to do this over a sea tile, and it will try to attack enemy navies. And port strike is the same, only this is executed over a coastline, so a piece of land that is adjacent to the coast and has a port on it, and it will try to catch enemy navies while they are docked. Generally, close air support is not exactly a great jack of all trades. I would limit them to close air support. Maybe use them for naval strike if you don't have any specific naval bombers. And lastly, if you are at peace and you want your pilots to be top-notch by the time war breaks out, you can simply train them just the same as you train your infantry or your army units. Shift-clicking this button will allow them to train until they reach level 3 and then they stop. Again, you want to limit your attrition. Planes are expensive, we don't want them crashing in training exercises if we can avoid it. And if you're feeling particularly lazy or simply don't want to constantly move airplanes around as the front changes, there is one more thing we can do. We can simply select our airplanes and then go to our armies, and you can see a little airplane with a plus icon. What this will do is assign those airplanes to support that specific army, meaning when the army is fighting in a region, the airplanes will move to support and execute the roles you have set for them here in support of that army. It's not 100% efficient, but it is easy, and it's a great way to get some air support if you're not 100% comfortable with micromanaging everything. And that brings us finally to the Navy. Again, to select the Navy, we can either select the individual ships or individual task forces in port, or we can do the big box drag and select them all. Ships are divided into navies. Navies have admirals, based again on their skills, you assign them. I assign Erich Reder to the surface fleets because he is a battleship adherent, and then I assign Karl Dönitz to my submarines because he is a sea wolf, giving him more submarine attack. Every fleet can once again be divided into task forces, which is an easy way to divide your fleet across multiple sea zones. For instance, if I want my submarines to do convoy raiding, which is what they are designed for, in the North Sea, they will move 2 task forces to the North Sea. Perfect. If I want to add the Eastern North Sea, they will move 1 into each territory. Now, if I were to add the Norwegian coast, it's going to get tricky because it's difficult to operate in 3 areas with only 2 task forces. What we can do is select one of those task forces separately and then split off units. Either cut them in half, this is my preferred method. Now we have 3 task forces. We can merge them once again with this button here, or we can simply select the units that we want to split off. I'll take these 4. Simply clicking with shift held down will select the units, and then we click with our right mouse button next to the task forces that we want these units to reinforce as a 3rd task force, et voila, an extra task force. Now the Navy is a complicated mess. More so if you have the Man the Guns DLC, which makes the Navy game a lot more complicated and granular. For a new player, I recommend you do 2 things. You keep your submarines separate from your surface ships, and you keep all your surface ships bunched up in one big navy. Why? The AI is pretty bad at using its navy, and you want to exploit that. Pretty much want to exploit that. While there is no way in hell that the Kriegsmarine could defeat the Royal Navy can't be everywhere at once, and we can concentrate our strength in a few select areas. Now, as for giving orders to our ships, like I've given my submarines the convoy raiding order, that means those submarines or the ships assigned with this mission will actively seek out and engage enemy convoys in the sea tiles that we have selected. If we were to set them to convoy escort, they will try and defend our convoys moving through these areas. Little tip here, submarines not exactly great for escorting anything. Alternatively, we have the strike force order, which means your ships will sit in port, ready to sail out at a moment's notice. This is best combined with the other order, patrol order. Patrol order means your entire task force or all the task forces you have assigned will sail out and constantly patrol the seas. As you can imagine, this requires an absurd amount of fuel and is not exactly cost effective. So a combination of patrol and strike force is usually best in theory, where your big dreadnoughts sit at port and wait, and your smaller destroyers with radar and good vision are patrolling the area around them. If the patrolling ships see an enemy, the strike force can respond. And then finally, we have the Naval Invasion Support Order. That means the entire Navy will sit at port and escort naval invasions like the one we set up earlier through the sea tiles we have marked. And lastly, the most important thing about the Navy game is the concept of naval supremacy. If you mouse over any tile that you have ships in or that you don't have ships in, you can see the amount of naval supremacy we have. For instance, the Danish belts here, we don't have any ships here, so we have 0% naval supremacy. If you mouse over the Eastern North Sea, you can see we have 100% naval supremacy, since we technically don't have any enemies, so there's nobody contesting that. And supremacy is calculated by a certain mix of the quality of your ships and the amount of ships you have. And then it pits that against the quality and amount of the enemy ships, and whoever has the highest supremacy gets to launch naval invasions and move through the sea zone with those land units on that specific invasion mission. That is pretty much the point of naval supremacy. It's a big deal if you want to invade. Don't worry, it sounds complicated, it's a lot easier than you think. If you want naval supremacy, just bunch up your entire navy, get every ship you have, and put them on the naval invasion support order, and you can simply wait until the enemy moves his navy away if his is more powerful, or you can get your naval invasion out the door with your navy ready to protect it if your navy happens to be stronger. Now I know, it sounds complicated. The navy also is rather complicated, but don't worry about it too much. As Germany, most of your fighting will be done on land, and by the time you're ready to launch Operation Sea Lion and invade the United Kingdom, you'll probably have quite a bit of experience under your belt already. And there's also a bunch of really great guides out there. Now I hope that with this very basic, very down-to-earth tutorial, I can enable some new players to finally go out there and play their first campaign successfully. I hope I've helped some people who are completely lost at this game to finally get some enjoyment out of their purchase. It is a great game, even for all the hate it sometimes gets. It's incredibly enjoyable. I've put over 2,000 hours into this, so be patient if at first you don't succeed. None of us did. It takes some practice, but I hope that with this you are now able to take those first few steps and go out there into the world and conquer some Lebensraum. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been a little different from my usual stuff, so for my regular viewers and veterans out there, don't worry, I've got some more stuff coming. If you liked the video, leave a like, it helps a lot with the algorithm. Also consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon if you want to be notified whenever I upload more content. If you didn't like it, that's fine, hit that dislike button, tell me what I did wrong. Always looking for some feedback. And if you want to support the channel and support what I do, consider joining the Bitter Seal Squad. Just hit that join button down there next to the subscribe button and it will take you to the YouTube membership page. It has all the information you need. Anyway, this has been me, Bitter Steel, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.